Frost and freeze are an inevitable part of the spring season, but how is climate change playing a role, and what impact will those frost and freeze conditions have on you as well as area farmers? I'm going to answer those questions and more. Thanks for tuning into this week's edition of the Climate Friday newsletter. Whether I found you on the YouTube channel, on WTOL 11 Plus, or a different streaming platform, good to have you here. And let's break down the science on frost and freeze, some trends that we have observed, and also some of the financial impacts that frost and freeze in the springtime can have on local farmers. Let's break down the data and get into those graphics right here. Spring frost and freeze happens almost every year, and we saw it this week. Hard to believe that a week ago we were basking in some summer-like temperatures with highs up in the 80s. However, this week brought us frosty conditions. In particular, it was Wednesday that was the coldest of the bunch, where we saw low temperatures plunging down to the lower 30s. Now, our average final frost of the year doesn't happen until early May, so this is nothing out of the ordinary, nothing pertinent to climate change. This is just, well, April doing what it typically does. Now, some of the biggest impacts come not just from a frost and freeze, but when that freeze occurs after the spring budding. This is particularly impactful for those spring blooms, and this is what we'd call a false spring. It's a weather whiplash of sorts, where the ups and downs in the erratic spring weather can spell trouble for some of the spring blooms. Now, one study actually found that climate change has played a role in the budding of flowers in the spring season, and it's happening earlier and earlier and earlier by the year. This study found a shift of 4.3 days earlier due to climate change and the warming temperatures, which makes sense. We have warmer winters and warmer early spring weather. Now, freeze tolerance is one of the problems that happens when we get these late season frosts and freezes. The reason for that is freeze tolerance in plants diminishes when they exit dormancy. In other words, when the flowers start to bloom and come out, well, they are a lot more susceptible to the impacts of Mother Nature and some of those overnight cold temperatures. Area farmers know well the impacts that a late season frost or freeze can have. In particular, 2012 is one year that comes to mind. In the state of Michigan, over $500 million in losses were suffered by farmers, in particular fruit crops, and part of that had to do with the ups and downs, those fluctuations in the weather that started off with an early bloom and ended with a hard freeze that proved to be detrimental. Now, usually the colder the temperature, the more impactful that is. 28 degrees, or in other words, slightly below freezing, that can be salvageable as far as fruit crop is concerned. That'll kill about 10% of a fruit crop, and of course, it depends on the specific crop that we're talking about. But once you start to dip down below 26, that is the threshold for what we call a hard freeze, and that'll kill around 90% of a fruit crop. That can have some detrimental impacts to area farmers, especially the smaller farmers, if they lose the entire crop due to those 25-degree temperatures. Really not a good thing at all. Now, it depends on the type of crop that we're talking about. Apples and peaches are two examples that I'm going to use in this example, but you can find more on WTOL.com in the web article that I've got. Now, we've got some pictures here and the temperatures that are required to cause some serious trouble for the apple crop. Now, when the bud is still enclosed and silver on the tip, that is when they are the most resistant to changes in the temperature, and it would take a temperature of 2 degrees to actually kill that crop. Now, once the tip starts to turn a little bit green, that is a sign of the spring season, and 10 degrees is the threshold that would mean trouble for that apple crop. Once it starts to open up a little bit more, 15 degrees, and once that bloom begins, that is when temperatures in the 20s can be totally detrimental to the apple crop. By about 24 to 25 degrees is when those temperatures can destroy an entire crop, and this is the threshold for a 90% destruction of that crop. Now, farmers can do some things to help mitigate and prevent and prepare in advance for the freezing conditions, and some of these have to do with devices that are put out in the orchards and out in the fields in particular that circulate the air. Now, what happens with these overnight lows is cold air is trapped near the Earth's surface, and that can cause some serious issues, especially once we dip down below 25 degrees. Warmer air is located higher up in the atmosphere, and that's what we call an inversion, where the cold air is all pooled near the ground and warm air is aloft. Now, some of these devices that go out in orchards actually spin that air around and help circulate it a little bit better, so some of that warm air sinks down closer to the ground level due to that mechanically enhanced circulation, and the colder air near the ground is lifted up, and that causes a little bit better mixing near the ground level. That can help mitigate some of the potential potential impacts of a springtime freeze and make the effects a little bit less dangerous. Now, one of the biggest impacts climate change has had is on the earlier bloom in the spring season, and part of that has to do with the fact that we have a longer growing season than before. In other words, frost and freeze, the season's getting shorter for that, and we're seeing more time to grow. That number has increased across the Great Lakes region by about 9 days, but most pronounced has been across the southwestern U.S., where almost 20 more days are frost and freeze free due to warming temperatures. Overall, our growing season has increased substantially. In the 21st century, that number is significantly higher than it was back in the 1970s over the last half century. Now, frost and freeze are an inevitable part of the spring season, and they typically do happen in late April and early May as well. Now, frost is defined as a 36-degree temperature reading, and we typically see frost through the 8th of May. Freeze, that typically wraps up by the end of April, and as I mentioned, the lower the thermometer gets, the more significant the impacts. A freeze occurs at 32 degrees, and the final freeze normally happens on April 26th, so the conventional wisdom to hold off until planting until after Mother's Day is founded in the evidence. Of course, a hard freeze at 26, that is even worse for the fruit crop than just a plain old freeze at 32. Of course, we've had some extreme years that violate the norms and the rules. The soonest that we've had our last frost of the year, that was on April 7th of 1878. And the latest we have had the final frost of the year. Yes, even in the month of June, frost and freeze can occur. And of course, that would not be good news for area farmers and for those with gardens as well. What about freeze? Well, sometimes it's over in March, and sometimes even the month of June. That very same year, 1972, we saw not only a frost, but also a freeze during the month of June. So what does the rest of April have in store? Overall, the trends are looking cooler than normal. I know we had that taste of summer last week, but chillier than normal conditions are expected, not just for the Great Lakes, but much of the country's midsection and even out towards the Rocky Mountains, seeing below normal conditions. That'll affect all of the Atlantic seaboard and the southeastern U.S. If you want warm, the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest is the only spot in the lower 48 that'll be above average in the temperature department. Now, as April and May continue to unfold, we are going to see inevitably some frosty and freezing conditions, and the WTOL 11 weather team will keep you updated whatever Mother Nature throws our way. I'll see you next Friday for the Climate Friday newsletter.